Commander Thrallvex stood in the recruitment hall, his 4 eyes scanning the data pad with growing disappointment. Another human had arrived at the Galactic Coalition's military base, and like all the others before him, this one showed absolutely nothing special on the scanners. No energy signature. No psionic waves. No enhanced strength markers. Just plain ordinary biology. The human walked into the testing chamber with steady steps. His name was Jake Morrison, 28 years old, former infantry soldier from some conflict on Earth that nobody in the galaxy particularly cared about. He had the build of someone who'd spent years training his body the old-fashioned way, through sweat and repetition. But in a universe where warriors could bend reality with their minds, physical fitness meant almost nothing. Around the chamber, other recruits were showing off their natural abilities. A tall, crystalline being named Vexer demonstrated how he could turn his body completely transparent and walk through solid walls. The crowd gasped in appreciation. Next, a reptilian female called Chakra took her turn, opening her jaws and releasing a stream of white-hot plasma that melted a steel target into slag within seconds. Even the smallest recruit, a furry creature barely reaching Jake's knee, generated a shimmering blue force field that deflected heavy weapons fire without breaking a sweat. Then came Jake's turn. The human stepped up to the testing platform, and Thrallvex activated the scanner array. The machines hummed, their sensors probing every cell in Jake's body, searching for any hint of supernatural ability. Minutes passed. The other recruits started whispering among themselves, some giggling, others looking uncomfortable. The scanners went silent. The display showed one word, negative. Nothing? Thrallvex muttered, checking the equipment. Maybe there was a malfunction. He ran the scan again. Same result. The human possessed no powers whatsoever. In a galaxy where even the weakest species could at least generate small electrical charges or see into different light spectrums, this human was completely ordinary. Jake seemed unbothered by the whispers spreading through the room. He just stood there waiting patiently, his face neutral. Thrallvex felt something almost like pity. Earth had been so excited to join the Galactic Coalition, to prove their warriors could stand alongside the greatest fighters in the universe. But every human who'd come through these doors had shown the same disappointing results. No powers. No abilities. Nothing that would keep them alive for even 5 minutes on a real battlefield. Mr. Morrison, Thrallvex said, trying to keep his tone professional rather than dismissive. Your physical conditioning is adequate, but as you can see, our combat divisions require certain capabilities that you simply don't possess. Without any supernatural abilities, you wouldn't survive actual combat situations. I'm assigning you to logistics support. You'll be managing supply chains and transport operations. It was a polite way of saying Jake would be nowhere near actual fighting. He'd be counting boxes in a warehouse while real warriors fought the Coalition's battles. Jake nodded once, accepting the assignment without argument or complaint. No anger, no protest, no demands to be given a chance. He just said, "Understood, sir," and walked out of the chamber. Some of the other recruits laughed openly now. A few made jokes about humans thinking they could play soldier with the big boys. Thrallvex watched Jake leave and made a note in his report. Another failed human recruit. Perhaps Earth needed to accept that some species simply weren't meant for military service. It wasn't an insult. Every species had their strengths. Humans were decent diplomats and had interesting cultural exports. Maybe that should be enough. What Thrallvex didn't know, what nobody in that room could possibly understand, was that Jake's grandfather had told him stories before he died. Strange stories about ancient visitors who came to Earth long before recorded history. Stories about gifts given and then forgotten, buried so deep in human DNA that modern science couldn't detect them. Stories that Jake had dismissed as the rambling fantasies of an old man. But deep in Jake's genetic code, in places where scanners couldn't reach, something very old was waiting. Something that had been sleeping for 50,000 years, waiting for the right moment to wake up. And in 3 months, when Jake's transport ship would be ambushed by raiders in the disputed zones, that moment would finally arrive. For now, though, Jake Morrison went to his new assignment in logistics, just another powerless human in a galaxy full of gods. The other recruits forgot about him within days. Commander Thrallvex filed his report and moved on to more promising candidates. Nobody suspected that the unremarkable human with no powers would soon change everything the galaxy thought it knew about strength and weakness. 3 months had passed since Jake started working in logistics, and he'd settled into a routine that most people would call boring. Loading cargo containers, checking inventory lists, making sure supply ships departed on schedule. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous. Just the kind of work that kept armies running but never got mentioned in the history books. Today started like any other day. Jake was assigned to Transport Vessel 7 Gamma, a basic cargo hauler carrying medical supplies and ammunition to forward bases near the disputed zones. The ship wasn't fancy, just a metal box with engines and a small crew of 12. Most of them were logistics personnel like Jake, various alien species who couldn't cut it in combat divisions. The rejects, as some soldiers called them. They were 4 hours into the journey when the alarms started screaming. Red lights flooded the cargo bay where Jake was securing some loose containers. His communicator crackled with panicked voices from the bridge. Multiple bogies inbound. KRYX raiders, at least 20 ships. Jake's stomach dropped. The KRYX were notorious throughout the galaxy. Savage, violent, and completely merciless. They attacked supply convoys for sport as much as profit, and they never left survivors. The small escort of 3 fighter ships that accompanied their transport didn't stand a chance. Through the viewports, Jake watched the brief battle. It lasted maybe 90 seconds. The coalition fighters tried their best, but the KRYX tore through them with ruthless efficiency. Plasma bolts lit up space like deadly fireworks. Then the escort ships were gone, just expanding clouds of debris, and the raiders turned their full attention to the transport. The ship shuddered as weapons fire punched through the hull. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut automatically, sealing off damaged sections. Jake ran toward the main cargo bay where other crew members were gathering, their faces showing pure terror. A crystalline Vexery was trying to phase through the walls to escape, but the ship's damaged power grid was interfering with his abilities. A Quilkin huddled in the corner, her force field flickering weakly. Then they heard it. The sound of cutting torches on the other side of the door. The KRYX were boarding. Someone started crying. Another crew member was frantically trying to send a distress signal, but they all knew help wouldn't arrive in time. The disputed zones were called that for a reason. No organized military presence, no quick response teams. They were alone. Jake felt something weird happen inside his chest. Not panic, not fear exactly, but something else. A feeling like remembering a dream he'd forgotten the moment he woke up. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, telling stories about ancient times, about visitors from the stars who taught humanity secrets that got buried in time. The door exploded inward. 5 KRYX warriors rushed through, their clawed hands crackling with bioelectric energy. They were massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in chitinous armor that grew naturally from their bodies. One of them grabbed the nearest crew member, a small maintenance worker, and electricity arced from the raider's claws. The worker's scream cut off abruptly. Jake didn't think. He just moved. Stepped between the KRYX and the rest of his crew, placing his body as a barrier even though he had nothing to fight with. No weapons, no powers, nothing except his own flesh that would tear apart the moment those claws touched him. The lead KRYX warrior looked at him and laughed, a horrible clicking sound. It raised its electrified claws to strike. And Jake spoke. The words came from somewhere deep inside, from a place he didn't know existed. They weren't English, weren't any language he'd learned. The sounds felt ancient, like they'd been carved into his bones before he was born. They resonated in his throat, his chest, vibrating through his entire body with a frequency that made his teeth ache. The cargo bay went completely silent. The KRYX warrior froze mid-strike, its claws just inches from Jake's face. Its eyes went wide, pupils dilating with something that looked like pure, primal terror. The creature's whole body started shaking. Behind it, the other 4 raiders had the same reaction, backing away slowly, their aggressive postures collapsing into something that resembled prey animals cornered by a predator. Jake spoke again, not knowing what he was saying but feeling the weight of each sound. Command. Authority. Something that transcended translation and spoke directly to the oldest parts of the brain where instinct lived. The KRYX warriors turned and ran. Not a tactical retreat, not a regrouping. They fled in absolute panic, scrambling over each other to get back to their boarding craft. Through the damaged hull, Jake could see their ships breaking off the attack, firing up engines and jumping to hyperspace within seconds. The entire raiding party abandoned the assault despite having overwhelming advantage. The cargo bay remained silent. Jake's crew members stared at him like he'd grown a second head. He was breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face, and his throat felt raw like he'd been screaming for hours. His hands were shaking. What did you just do?" someone finally whispered. Jake had no answer. He didn't understand it himself. Whatever had just happened, whatever words had come out of his mouth, they'd scared away the most violent raiders in the galaxy. Raiders who normally fought to the death, who never retreated, who considered fear a weakness to be eliminated. But somehow Jake had made them run. The security footage from Jake's transport ship spread through Coalition Command like wildfire. Within 48 hours, every senior officer had watched it at least 3 times. Commander Thralvex sat in his office, replaying the scene for the 20th time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The human spoke and the KRYX ran. That shouldn't be possible. Nothing made the KRYX retreat. Then the strangest thing happened. A message came through from Draken Prime, the homeworld of the oldest species in the galaxy. The Draken were requesting, no, demanding, to see the human immediately. Not asking for the footage, not requesting a report. They wanted Jake Morrison brought before their council in person. This was unprecedented. The Draken rarely left their world. They were ancient beyond measure, massive creatures that resembled the dragons from Earth's old myths. Scaled bodies the size of houses, wings that could blot out the sun, and the ability to breathe fire hot enough to melt starship hulls. They'd been exploring the galaxy when most current species were still swimming in primordial oceans. For them to take interest in anything was remarkable. For them to take interest in a human was unthinkable. 2 days later, Jake found himself standing in a council chamber carved from volcanic rock that predated most civilizations. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above him, and the walls were covered in symbols he couldn't read. Seated in a semicircle before him were 7 Draken elders, each one radiating an aura of age and power that made the air feel heavy. The largest of them, a dragon whose scales shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between gold and crimson, leaned forward. Her name was Matriarch Solara, and her eyes held the weight of millennia. "Speak," she commanded, her voice resonating through the chamber like distant thunder. "Speak the words you used on that ship." Jake stood there, feeling incredibly small and out of place. He opened his mouth, tried to remember how it felt in that cargo bay, the words that had come from nowhere. But nothing happened. His throat made normal sounds, normal words in standard English. Whatever he'd done before, he couldn't replicate it consciously. I don't know how," he admitted. "It just happened. I can't control it." The dragons exchanged glances, and Jake could feel some kind of silent communication passing between them. When Solara spoke again, there was something in her tone that sounded almost like sadness mixed with wonder. "Sit, human. We have much to tell you about your species, things that even you have forgotten." Jake sat on the floor, there were no human-sized chairs in a dragon council chamber, and listened as Solara began to speak. 50,000 years ago we came to your world. Earth you call it. We were explorers then, travelers seeking to understand the universe and share knowledge with younger species. We found your ancestors living in caves, using primitive stone tools, barely able to communicate with each other. By all measures they were unremarkable. Just another species taking its first steps toward intelligence. Another elder, whose scales were deep blue like the ocean, continued the story. But we noticed something different about humans. Something in the way your brains were structured. You had no natural abilities, no claws, no armor, no powers. You were physically weak compared to most species. But your minds were blank slates in a way we'd never encountered before. Pure potential with no predetermined path. Solara took over again. So we decided to try an experiment. We taught your ancestors the first language. The tongue of creation itself, the words that shaped reality before the universe settled into the physical laws you know today. We taught it to other species before, species with great natural powers. But they all lost it within a few generations. Their existing abilities interfered with the language, created mental blocks. The gift faded. Jake felt his mouth go dry. This was insane. But somehow deep down it felt true. Like remembering something he'd always known but never consciously thought about. Humans did something we thought impossible, the blue-scaled elder said. You had no powers to interfere with the learning process. So instead of the language fading away, you absorbed it completely. You encoded it into your DNA, buried it so deep that it became part of your genetic structure. Even you forgot it was there. But it never disappeared. It's been sleeping in every human ever born, waiting? Waiting for what? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. For the moment when a human would need it desperately enough for instinct to override conscious thought, Solara answered. What you did on that ship wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural power. It was you speaking the first language through pure instinct. The Kerwex didn't run from you, they ran from the echo of creation itself, channeled through a human voice. Jake's head was spinning. His grandfather's stories weren't myths. They were history, passed down through generations, getting distorted over time but keeping the essential truth alive. Can I learn to control it? He asked. That's why we brought you here, Solara said, and for the first time, Something like a smile crossed her massive features. "We're going to teach you what we taught your ancestors. But be warned, human. The training will be harder than anything you've experienced. The first language doesn't work like normal speech. You're not learning, you're remembering something that's been buried for 50,000 years. And digging that deep into your own mind can be painful." Jake stood up, meeting the ancient dragon's gaze without flinching. "When do we start?" The first morning on Draken Prime almost killed Jake. Not from training but from simply existing on the planet. The atmosphere was thicker than Earth's, each breath feeling like he was inhaling soup. The gravity was 30% heavier, making every movement exhausting. And the air itself seemed charged with some kind of energy that made his skin tingle and his bones ache constantly. Matriarch Solara watched him struggle through basic exercises that first week with patient eyes. "Your body will adapt," she told him. "Humans are remarkable that way. You're fragile but flexible. Give it time." She was right. After 2 weeks, breathing became easier. His muscles adjusted to the heavier gravity. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to what came next, trying to consciously speak the first language. They started in a training cavern deep beneath the surface, where the rock walls were covered in ancient carvings. Symbols that predated written language, sounds given visual form. Solara would demonstrate a word, her massive form vibrating with tones that Jake could feel in his chest cavity. "Don't think of it as speaking," she instructed. "Think of it as remembering. The words are already inside you. You're not learning them, you're uncovering them." Jake tried. He stood in that cavern for 8 hours straight, attempting to reproduce the sounds Solara made. His throat grew raw. His voice cracked and broke. Nothing worked. The sounds came out wrong, flat, powerless. Just normal noise without any of the resonance or weight they were supposed to carry. "You're thinking too much," another elder named Raxthorn observed. He was older than Solara, his scales scarred from countless battles. "On that transport ship you didn't think. You just acted. Your conscious mind is getting in the way." That night, Jake sat alone on a cliff overlooking the dragon cities below. Bioluminescent crystals lit the buildings, creating a landscape that looked like captured starlight. He felt frustrated, inadequate. Back on that ship, the words had poured out of him like water. Now, trying deliberately, he couldn't produce even a whisper of that power. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The training was relentless. Solara would wake him before dawn, have him practice vocal exercises that made his throat bleed. Then meditation for hours, trying to reach that instinctive place where the first language lived. Then physical conditioning to strengthen his body enough to withstand the strain of speaking words that could reshape reality. One morning something clicked. Jake was practicing alone in the cavern, exhausted and ready to give up, when he stopped trying to force it. He closed his eyes and thought about that moment on the transport ship. Not the words he'd said but the feeling behind them. The desperate need to protect his crew. The absolute certainty that he wouldn't let them die. He spoke. A single word. The cavern walls vibrated. Dust fell from the ceiling. The sound wasn't loud but it carried weight, pressing against the air itself like something physical. Jake opened his eyes and saw a small flame hovering in front of him, burning without fuel, existing purely because he'd told reality to make it so. He'd spoken fire. Every dragon on the planet felt it. Solara arrived within minutes, her eyes wide. "Again," she commanded. Jake tried to repeat it, failed 3 times, then succeeded on the 4th attempt. The flame appeared again and this time he could feel how it worked. The word wasn't commanding fire to exist, it was convincing the universe that fire belonged in that space. It was reality manipulation through sound and will combined. "Now you understand," Solara said, and pride colored her voice. "The first language doesn't create or destroy. It persuades. It negotiates with existence itself. And humans?" She paused, studying Jake with those ancient eyes. "Humans are natural negotiators. You've spent your entire evolution learning to convince each other, to argue and debate and change minds. You were born for this." The training accelerated. Jake learned construction, words that strengthen molecular bonds, turning paper into something harder than steel. He learned disruption, the opposite, making solid matter lose cohesion and crumble to dust. He learned perception, extending his consciousness through sound, seeing through walls, sensing life forms from kilometers away. But the hardest lesson came when Raxthorn explained why the dragons had really brought him here. "The Kerwiks have been gathering," the old dragon said one evening. "Our intelligence suggests they're preparing for something unprecedented. And they're being led by something our scanners can't identify. Something that makes our technology malfunction just by existing near it. He pulled up a holographic image, readings from deep space that looked more like glitches than actual data. We believe the void WIRM has awakened. A creature of anti-creation, something that existed before the first language gave structure to chaos. It's the opposite of everything you're learning. Where you speak words of creation, it sings entropy and decay. Jake felt cold despite the warm cavern air. And you think that's why I suddenly gained access to the first language? Some kind of cosmic balance. We don't believe in coincidences, Solara said quietly. The universe has patterns. When great darkness rises, it often calls forth an answer. You may be that answer, Jake Morrison. The first human in 50,000 years to fully awaken to what your species can become. 2 weeks later, the urgent transmission arrived. The KRYX fleet was moving toward Coalition space. Millions of ships, more than had ever gathered in recorded history. And at their center, distorting space itself, came the void WRM. The war had begun. The KRYX armada appeared on the sensors like a swarm of locusts, so many ships that they blocked out the stars. Jake stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship, watching the view screen with a sick feeling in his stomach. He'd trained for months, learned to speak words that could bend reality, but nothing prepared him for this. Millions of enemy vessels, all converging on the frontier world of Kestara where 300,000 colonists waited for evacuation. Behind the KRYX fleet came something worse. The void WRM was massive beyond comprehension, easily the size of Earth's moon. But calling it a creature didn't feel right. It was more like a hole in space, a wound in reality itself. Where it moved, stars dimmed. Ship sensors went haywire. Even looking at it on the view screen made Jake's eyes hurt, like his brain couldn't properly process what it was seeing. The Coalition fleet moved to intercept. Every available warship, thousands of vessels including the entire Dragon military legion. Matriarch Solara commanded her own battle group, her massive form visible through the viewport as she flew through space without need of a ship, breathing stellar fire at KRYX raiders. The battle started, and within minutes, Jake understood they were losing. The void WRM wasn't just a physical threat. Its mere presence was doing something to the fabric of space. All around the battlefield, supernatural abilities were failing. The crystalline Vexery soldiers couldn't phase anymore. The Quilkin force fields flickered and died. Even the dragon's fire was weaker, sputtering like candles in a storm instead of the devastating weapons they should be. It's suppressing our powers, Commander Thralvex reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. All supernatural abilities are being nullified. We're fighting with conventional weapons only, and we're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Jake watched the battle unfold, ships exploding in silent bursts of light. Hundreds dying every second. His mind raced. The dragons had taught him that the void WRM represented anti-creation, the opposite of the first language. It wasn't nullifying powers, it was speaking its own language, one of entropy and dissolution. Then understanding hit him like a physical blow. It's not suppressing anything, he said aloud. It's speaking anti-language, the sound of unmaking. And everyone's abilities come from the first language, so they can't function when anti-language is present. Thralvex turned to him. Can you fight it? You speak the first language. No, Jake said slowly, his mind working through the problem. I'd just be shouting creation words at something that embodies destruction. We'd cancel each other out at best. He paused, feeling something shift in his understanding. But humans, we're different. Solara's voice came through the communicator, urgent. Jake, what are you thinking? The dragons taught other species the first language, species that already had powers. But humans had nothing. We were empty. And that emptiness let us absorb the language completely. Jake's hands were shaking, but his voice grew steady. We didn't just learn creation. We're built to hold contradictions. We understand that we're insignificant specks in an infinite universe, but we also believe our individual lives matter. We know we're going to die, but we act like we're immortal. We hold opposites in our heads every single day. He looked at the void WRM on the screen. I think I can speak both. Creation and destruction simultaneously. Because humans have been doing that since we first became conscious. We've been holding the paradox of existence and entropy together in our minds. That would kill you, Solara said flatly. No consciousness can contain both languages. They'll tear you apart. Maybe a dragon consciousness can't, Jake replied. But I'm human. We're stubborn that way. Before anyone could stop him, Jake opened a fleet-wide channel. He knelt on the bridge floor, pressed his palms flat against the deck and reached deep inside himself. Past the first language he'd learned, down to something even older. The part of humanity that had always known death was coming, that built civilizations anyway. That created art knowing it would crumble, that loved people knowing they'd lose them. He began to speak. The first sounds were the first language, words of construction and creation that reinforced reality. But between each syllable in the spaces where breath became voice, he spoke the opposite. Anti-language, pulled from that same ancestral memory but inverted. The sound of stars dying, of entropy claiming all things, of the universe's eventual heat death. It should have killed him instantly. The two languages were fundamental opposites, like matter and antimatter meeting. But Jake was human, and humans had evolved to believe contradictory truths with absolute conviction. His voice spread across the battlefield like a wave. Where it touched, something impossible happened. The suppression field collapsed. Not because Jake overpowered it, but because he acknowledged its right to exist while simultaneously asserting creation's equal claim. He spoke balance into existence, forcing the universe to accept both truth and anti-truth at once. Powers came back online. The Vexery could phase again. Dragons breathed full-strength fire. But more importantly, something else happened. Every single KRYX warrior heard Jake's voice and stopped fighting. Their aggressive fury simply vanished, replaced by something like religious awe. They weren't hearing a battle command. They were hearing the fundamental equation of existence itself, spoken through a human throat in a way that made denial impossible. The KRYX fleet powered down. Weapons went offline. Warriors laid down arms. An entire species surrendered to a truth they couldn't resist. The Void WRM turned its full attention on Jake. On the view screen, that massive wound in reality rippled, focusing on this impossible creature who could speak languages that should be mutually exclusive. For one terrible moment, Jake felt the weight of anti-creation pressing down on him, trying to unmake his existence. Then he spoke a third word, one the dragons had never taught because they didn't know it existed. A word that came from pure human instinct. Acceptance. The acknowledgement that both creation and destruction deserved to exist, that life meant nothing without death, that entropy wasn't evil but necessary. The Void WRM paused. Then, in a gesture that would be studied for centuries, it bowed. Not in defeat, beings like that didn't understand defeat. But in recognition. It had been searching since before time began for something that could understand its nature without fear or hatred. It had finally found one. The creature folded itself through dimensions and vanished, taking its existential threat with it. Jake collapsed, blood running from his nose and ears. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. Solara caught him with one massive claw, surprisingly gentle. Around them, something unprecedented happened. The dragon warriors began landing on the flagship's hull. One by one, these ancient beings who'd ruled the galaxy for millions of years, who'd taught humanity its greatest gift, lowered themselves in gestures of respect. The dragons bow to no one, Raxthorn's voice came through the communicator. But before the binding tongue, before a voice that holds all possibility, we remember what we are. Old human. We are very old. But you are potential incarnate. Jake looked up at the assembled might of dragonkind kneeling before him and laughed weakly, the sound broken and raw. You told me I had no power. We were catastrophically wrong, Solara said softly. You have the greatest power in existence. The ability to become anything, even something that shouldn't be possible. You are every limitation transcended. As medical teams rushed forward, as the KRYX formally requested to join the coalition under human mediation, as the galaxy tried to process what it had witnessed, one truth crystallized. Humanity had been judged powerless because nobody understood that having nothing meant they could become everything. In their emptiness lay infinite potential. In their weakness, ultimate strength. Commander Thralvex stood watching the dragons kneel before a species he'd dismissed as combat incapable, and finally understood. The dragons hadn't taught Jake to use power. They'd taught him wisdom before showing him he could unmake reality itself with his voice. The galaxy would never underestimate humans again.